Welcome back to another episode of the H3X Podcast, where we discuss the head, heart, and hands of the multiplying church and our leaders. All right, Dave. So earlier this year, we worked our way through the 5 T's. Been super helpful that Will Smith kind of brought this framework in. Super helpful for us to get some, maybe just a starting place for how to tackle target as the first spot of how do we
Sure.
identify a target, and then how do we build some structure and a plan to reach that target. And so we've been engaging with those 5 T's in some different ways, and even recent podcasts talking about target and teaming. But really, I've just been processing through teaming specifically. And as we're in a new context, it's got really that's part of why, just kind of stirring me up into that. But I think it's really helpful for us in general to think, if we're not just a static team, that it is what it is, and it's going to be like that for 5 years or 10 years. But actually, teaming happens around common rhythms, and that as we begin to find where we overlap and collaborate, communicate, contribute, connect towards reaching no place
Right.
left, then we'll find team in that place, some teaming. So I want to just kind of look at 4 different ways that I've begun to unpack around how we can find and build teaming.
Well, and I'd say I'm really excited about this conversation when you shared it with me, Mark, because we kind of fell into this in Oklahoma City by the grace of God, and
Yeah.
a few battles along the way, and a lot of relationship building, a lot of intentionality for us to say we need each other for the task, because our desire to reach the city is what really drove us coming together and seeing what we were able to see with a handful of people in Oklahoma City, which was so beautiful. And now, you moving to New York City, looking back on that now, I'm just super excited to hear you kind of process, how did we get there and what did the Lord do? And I just want to hear these 4 to learn from you on what you're looking for and trying to help build.
And I think that's a really helpful way to summarize it, because I think as I go into a new context, this happens for all of us, right? As we're starting over or starting something new, we have to go back and reflect on what we learned, and we thought it was in us, but then we realize, oh, maybe I've got to actually process it. So this is really just me processing, like you said. This is what we did that was intuitive, but how do I begin to put some language to it? But so yeah, let's look at these 4 things. The first thing that came to my mind was join. That as we're seeking to identify teaming, and it might be helpful to check out that teaming circle. We'll put that in the show notes here. That Bud Houston has really helped to bring in for us, this concentric circles of teaming. Not going to dive into that
Right.
too much on this episode, but you can go take a look at that. But how do we begin to join what exists already? So we don't always need to reinvent the wheel. In fact, teaming, it may actually be more helpful towards building bridges for teaming by joining existing structures where there's a common vision.
Right. Yeah. I'd say sometimes whenever you want to be, I'll say the man, right? You want to go and you land. One of the things that I think is helpful for teaming to actually occur is for you to understand, I'm not the first one there. God is already at work. God's already been moving his church forward, and I'm stepping into what God is doing, and to start looking for those people that God has already put in place to learn from and to join is huge.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I mean, as a specific example, as we begin to dive in here, we begin to kind of look at, the first 2 characteristics of movements are abundant prayer and abundant sowing
Right.
of the gospel. So we're like, okay, we got to get out there and begin to do that stuff. But what if there's already some of that in motion? And so as we just begin to connect with people, we found like-minded people that already had a prayer meeting going, that honestly, the Holy Spirit was moving really powerfully, and it was really focused on praying for the nations and specific people groups, and even the people groups that we were moving towards. So we could have gone to start something, but why not just join what was already there? So number 1.
Yeah, and I love the concept of, even if you're if you're an established team, make sure that you're open to letting people be a part of those things. And if you don't yet have an established team, look for people who are open for you to join up with those things.
That's right. So that leads kind of into the second one. So number 2 out of ways to increase teaming would be invite. And so I think what's been helpful for me as I've kind of processed this with you, Dave, and then I think with all those guys, with Will and Kyle and Bud, who are on the episodes that we did on the 5 T's. But it's not just inviting them into anything, but really
Right.
it's the core missionary task of the four fields. And so again, that's what we see in Acts 13 and 14, that Paul and Barnabas, they're engaging new fields. They're sharing the gospel. They're making disciples out of those that they find. They're gathering them as church, and they're raising up leaders. And they're also praying in the midst of all of that. That's tying all of that together. And so the invite piece really it's this call to just do it. What we're going to do the four fields, and then we're really going to begin to find those that are not just giving lip service to a value for this stuff, but they're actually going to put feet to it and do it. So we do it, and then we invite what we feel like might be like-minded, Great Commission believers to join us in doing that.
Yeah, and I love these 2 points. I think there's a tension that's going to happen, right? Because we're talking about somebody who is saying, I believe that the core missionary, core apostolic task is the core of what I ought to be doing. Like that's actually driving, right? The entry, the gospeling, the discipleship, the church formation, and the leadership development is driving what I ought to be doing, which means that when I invite, that assumes I have a direction and a strategy and where I'm going. And sometimes the join and invite will start to become tension, because it's hard sometimes for us to walk in the tension of being a learner while at the same time having a direction that I want to go. And I think if they do go back to that teaming discussion and know the difference between team, which may be long-term, which may be very, very consistent on what we're doing in terms of strategy and belief and methodology, versus teaming, where I'm joining with people who are doing things similar that are helpful for my direction, but may not be long-term, will help to understand the tension. Because if we ever stop being the learner and the joiner, then we're going to miss out on a lot of opportunities that can help inform what we're inviting people into as well.
That's right. That's right. Well, let's look at these last two, and this I just directly stole from Will Smith, so we're quoting a lot of
We'll take it
on this episode of just, and hopefully that just kind of inspires you to go back and listen to those 5T episodes if you haven't already, because a lot of this is building on top of that. But Will, sure. He just brilliantly, to me, summarized up as you're getting started, projects and processes as a really helpful way to think about the containers or the buckets for what does this look like to begin to get some things going. And so projects as a way to build teaming. And so whether that's creating projects or identifying projects that might already be out there, again, to join, but just maybe separating that from join to even just like what are like not maybe ongoing, but a project or a structure that can create collaboration. And so I thought of the examples of, evangelism, short-term teams. You might have a short-term team push, or maybe there's a rhythm of a project around a specific target that there's an evangelism push for. Research is one that we don't talk about often enough, but
right.
You've
also
really,
Bud's also in Bud's wheelhouse.
Also in Bud's wheelhouse. He's got what is it? UPG North America.
North America.
Right.
Right.
So check out that URL, upgnorthamerica.net, I think.
I think it is. Yep.
Yeah, so a ton of research that has been done by the organization Global Gates that is just serving the mess out of everybody here in North America. They've just done so much work. But that's a project, and they're continuing to collaborate and team around that project. And irregardless of org or network, they want to collaborate with people towards the end of reaching unreached people groups. And so that's a project that we can join in, but it's also a good example of a way to build teaming around a project.
Right. Good. What about processes? I know you mentioned that. So in your mind, whenever you think of some examples of what it looks like for process.
Yeah, I think process. So when it comes to teaming, a process is really important because it gives us clarity on where we can and we can't team. That feels really key. And again, I'm going to reference the teaming circles because that's kind of the framework for this conversation. So check that out as we're talking through this. But I think once you hit some of those more inner circles on the teaming piece of discipleship, church, and leadership, there's a clear process around each of those concentric circles towards the middle that is going to differ depending on the network or the church that you connect in with. But outside of those circles, the process might be a little bit different. So number one, having clarity of your process will help you to know how much you can team and with whom, and allow collaboration. But also maybe expectations get defined through having clarity of those processes, so that there may be some ways that you can team with people around leadership development would be an example. So
Sure.
we want leaders that are gonna so there's a church here in town in New York called New Life, and they have a pastor wrote a famous book, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, and there's some helpful nuggets in there. And so maybe even in leadership development, there's a place for receiving from some of what they're doing, but having a clear understanding of the process, so that that role of teaming isn't just completely undefined, but there's expectations defined, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Again, we're back in that tension, right? Of what it looks like to have a clear direction that you're going, but at the same time, working with people who may differ from you and finding where that balance is. And I think when you're doing projects, it's a helpful way for you to cross-pollinate and to join in on what's happening, what God's doing in the city. But at the same time, it's also a great place for you to introduce to other people some of the ideas that you'd like for them to understand, and some of the biblical principles that we're using that might be helpful to them. And vice versa. So yeah, what's that fourth one that you had in mind?
Yeah, the process piece. That's the fourth one. But yeah, I think the one other piece there that
the projects and processes together.
Yeah, two separate ones. But the one other piece on the process, I would say, we've used this language sometimes on our podcast of zero to church or lost to leader. That's a real just clear articulation of a process. And having clarity of the process of how somebody goes from lost to leader, or how you get from zero to church, really it frees you up to begin to have eyes to see where you could team with people. Otherwise, sure, if you don't have that clarity of how somebody's walking down that path towards church or from lost to leader, whatever you want to identify it, you may run into a whole bunch of people that you could actually team with, and you don't even know that you could be teaming with them because you don't have the clarity of where you could actually on-ramp with them in that process. So I guess more than anything else on the process piece, teaming really begins with you sitting down and making sure that you're clear.
Well, Mark, as always, I love it whenever you are looking back and you're thinking through. I'm just gonna officially put it out there. I have coined the term Mark-splaining. It's whenever you take something that I confuse everybody with, or is completely confusing to everybody, and you just break it down and go, yeah, here's what we're saying. And I think these four of joining, finding a work that's doing, joining, then inviting other people into what you're doing, and then having projects that you can do that are short term, and then having processes that are the longer term ways, are a great way to figure out who your team and teaming is. Helpful nuggets as always, Mark. I just love basically stealing everything that you're learning as you're kind of debriefing in the new few months in New York.
Well, man, I know we've talked about this a lot, but just I feel like I just am so slow sometimes to process this stuff, and I just fail forward. And so if there's any clarity that you can benefit from, you or anybody else, it really is because I just feel like I just keep punching at it and keep going, because I'm not clear until I get clarity. So man, I'm glad it could be helpful. But yeah, thanks for talking through this. And again, I think what this has been for me has been doing this. And so that, I guess, what I'd say to everybody listening to this, of we just did this in OKC. We were just kind of trying to figure this out.
Right. And
some clarity came out of just doing it. So if that all isn't clear, what we just talked about, just go do it. Go start trying to connect with people, communicate, collaborate. And then I love how Dave adds that word contribute. And as you do those 4 different C's, I think that's where we begin to get clarity of how this teaming process can work.
Thanks for teeing up the next podcast. I think we're going to have to talk about the 4 C's now.
Let's do it. Awesome.
Cool.
Thanks, guys. See you next time.